Hey guys, we are up now to topic 6.12 of the APUSH curriculum called Controversies over the Role of Government in the Gilded Age. That's quite a long title, and we're going to focus on things like strikes, government, economic policy, and so forth. We're also going to look at a big economic crash called the Panic of 1893. So let's look at some the motivations and effects of what's known as laissez-faire policies. So let's first figure out what laissez-faire is all about. And this is something you've learned about in previous classes, so hopefully this is just a review for you. What laissez-faire economics is the idea that the government should basically stay out of the economy to the greatest extent possible. Little or no government regulation of business. Laissez-faire actually comes from French. It means basically let do, as in let businesses operate as they see fit. And in the laissez-faire system, the market economy, as we might call it, instead of government regulating businesses, what regulates the economy is the so-called invisible hand, which is this law of supply and demand. So the economy automatically adjusts for demand and supply, and prices fluctuate accordingly. So in laissez-faire, you have, of course, lots of economic freedom. You can invest your money freely, you can buy what you want, you can sell what you want. You can make a lot of money or you can lose a lot of money. And again, the government regulation is limited, and they also don't tax very heavily at all because they're not trying to influence the economy. The economy just runs by itself. So this was the model that was being really pushed by a lot of the big businessmen of the era, the so-called tycoons or robber barons or captains of industry or whatever you want to call them. However, the same people that were calling for more and more laissez-faire were also taking advantage of government involvement in the economy, which is something they professed not to like. So while they liked low taxes on their income, they liked high tariffs to protect their industries. So they liked certain taxes, just not taxes on them specifically. They liked federal subsidies. So they don't want the government telling what they can and cannot do, but they like the government helping businesses. A great example of those federal subsidies would be the land and loans given out to the transcontinental railroads. But of course, there are lots of other examples of this as well. They, again, profess to want the government to stay out of business, but they also like the government regulating labor unions and, in fact, banning labor unions in many cases. So it's, those who are professing laissez-faire don't necessarily mean total laissez-faire. They just like the government helping out certain groups and not other groups. All right, let's talk a little bit about some famous strikes from the Gilded Age. And we're going to begin with something called the Great Railroad Strike of 1877. So in 1877, the four biggest railroads in America agreed collectively to cut wages by 10%. Now, 10% may not seem like a big deal, but it really is. I mean, if I were to cut all your grades by 10%, think about how that would affect your GPA, right? You had a 90 and now you have an 81. You'd be furious. And these workers were furious, and they took to striking and damaging, railroad property and being, they're voicing their dislike about these policies, and it starts to spread all across America. So much so that President Rutherford B. Hayes, sends in federal troops to put down the strikes and try to get things back in order. When it's all said and done, about 100 people were killed in these clashes between the militia, factory guards, police, and of course the striking workers themselves. It was just an absolute mess. And here are a couple of images you can see from the Great Railroad Strike. You've got the militia called out, lots of things on fire. It was chaotic. All right, now we're going to go to the Homestead Strike of 1892. So Homestead was this huge steel mill complex outside of Pittsburgh. And again, it was owned by Andrew Carnegie, the famous steel guy. And the workers were upset about, among other things, wage cuts. You notice that trend is happening, right? Wage cuts provoke strikes. and the workers begin to organize. They arm themselves. The Carnegie authorities respond by bringing in 300 Pinkertons. Now, if you're not sure what a Pinkerton is, Pinkerton was a famous private detective agency, and they were called in to guard the steel mill, and they were armed. And clashes break out between the Pinkertons and the striking workers. And in these clashes, about 10 or so died, some 60 were wounded. And again, these are basically gun battles erupting. In fact, at one point, the Pinkertons were basically forced to surrender and lay down their guns by the armed workers. But, like in a lot of these strikes, eventually troops were called in, and the strike was crushed. Our next strike takes place in 1894, and it takes place in a place called Pullman, Illinois. So Pullman, Illinois is outside of Chicago, and it is what we call a company town. So Pullman was this famous maker of rail cars. They're called Pullman Palace cars, very luxurious first-class type rail cars for people who are going on trips. And the company town was, by all accounts, a very nice place. It was, the company built nice homes. They built a school. They had a park there for their workers and all that stuff. But in 1893, the economy of the United States begins to rapidly decline. Again, we're going to talk about the Panic of 1893 in a few moments. And with that economic depression onsetting, there's not as much demand for rail cars anymore. So the Pullman Palace Car Company decides to cut their wages by a third. So again, you were earning $9, now you're earning $6 for the same amount of work for the same amount of time. Now, if that wasn't bad enough for the workers, the rent they're paying in their factory-owned homes was not cut. So we're going to cut your wages, but we're not going to cut your rent. And this was the final straw. Now, there were 150,000 workers ready to go out on strike, and they were led by Eugene V. Debs. And that's a name you want to remember because we're going to come back and revisit him a couple more times, particularly when we get to World War I. We're going to see him. So let's think about this. Is the federal government going to side with the Pullman strikers or the Pullman Company? And the answer is pretty obvious. It's the Pullman Company. Now, remember, Pullman, Illinois is nearby Chicago, and Chicago was the most important railroad city in America. Lots and lots of rail lines all converged in Chicago. And this strike basically ties down the rail network in Chicago, which means it's going to affect the rest of the country because trains are piling up because they can't get through because of the strike. And eventually the Attorney General, Richard Olney, who had been, in fact, a lawyer on behalf of railroads before he became the Attorney General, urges our President, Grover Cleveland, to use federal troops to end the strike. And his rationale was because the strike is snarling rail traffic, mail delivery can't get through, and that's a real problem. And so Grover Cleveland said if it takes the entire Army and Navy to deliver a postal card in Chicago, that card will be delivered. So the troops are called out. There are clashes, again, between strikers and federal forces. Some 30 workers are going to be killed, many more wounded. Debs himself was arrested and sent to prison for 6 months. And while in prison, he's going to become a hardcore socialist. And again, we'll come back and talk about him a little bit later. All right, now let's look at that Panic of 1893 that I just referenced in regard to the Pullman Strike. So, first of all, the word panic, we don't use this really anymore. In economics, we use things like recession or maybe even depression. This was probably the biggest economic crisis until the Great Depression. It was a major economic problem in America. And the Panic of 1893 is really the result of our business cycle that is pretty much continuous. So in the business cycle, what happens is, stock prices and productivity and efficiency and profits and all that, they're going up and up. And then there's usually kind of some sort of spike where we call this a bull market where people are buying and buying and everyone kind of assumes that the growth is going to be more or less permanent. And then at some point, for a variety of reasons, stock prices and profits begin to go down. And then they go down rapidly. There's this rapid drop. And that leads you to that depression or recession, or in this case we call it a panic. And then what happens is ultimately we kind of go back to normal, and then the cycle starts all over again. So what are the causes of the Panic of 1893? Well, in the lead up to the Panic of 1893, there had been a frenzy of building railroads and factories and telegraph lines and steel mills and everything you can imagine. There was just simply too much of everything. There was just too many factories, too many products, not enough consumption. And there was also this issue of over-speculation, that people, again, assuming that land prices and stock prices were always going to keep going up, had invested heavily, and then when those prices begin to decline, it all begins to kind of fall out, the bottom falls out. And then there's also the call for inflation. Remember, inflation, people and debtors, they like inflation, but investors hate inflation because inflation will rob you of any, well, maybe not all, but certainly some of the profits you would make by buying and selling something. And so that might caution you from actually investing. And if you don't have people investing in the economy, it can't grow. And so you have all these problems all kind of coming together as one big, almost like bomb, economic bomb that's going to explode. So the effects are what you'd kind of expect from an economic depression. You're going to have thousands of businesses closing up shop. You're going to have people who are unemployed, hungry, being evicted from their homes. The government is not bringing in a lot of tax revenue, so they're running a deficit. And even though that's how we do things these days, is run a federal deficit every single year, that's not how they did things back then. It was genuinely scary to bring in less money than the government was spending every year, because that, of course, means the national debt goes up. Now, remember, this is not, even though the economic crisis is a big one, the response to it is not going to be what we're going to say with like the Great Depression. Famously, Grover Cleveland had said that though the people should support the government should not support the people. And what he meant by that is people should, in fact, support the government, but the government shouldn't be financially supporting you, right? So you should have faith in the government, you should vote, you should be faithful in our government's ability to do what it needs to do. But don't look to the government for handouts. We're not going to give you any type of welfare or any type of assistance. That's just not what we're going to do, because the theory is if the government does give you that assistance, you'll become addicted to it, your work ethic will be ruined, and the government will simply be spending way more money than it has. Now, this brings us to a real economic problem involving the gold standard. So we're not on the gold standard these days, but in this time period we were. And what the gold standard said basically is that the money in circulation needed to be backed up by gold. So there had to be gold reserves for the paper money that's in circulation. And the problem with this is if the government's not bringing in a lot of revenue because of the Panic of 1893, and they're spending more than they're bringing in, what's happening is the gold reserves of the federal government's beginning to be depleted. They're starting to run low. And in fact, it may get to the point where there's not enough gold to back up the currency, and we might have to drop off the gold standard, which would be, well, it was thought of anyways as being devastating. So we've got to get our hands on some gold to build up the gold reserves. And so what Grover Cleveland does is he turns to J.P. Morgan, the most famous banker of his era, and probably all time, and a group of Wall Street bankers who agree to lend $65 million worth of gold to the U.S. government. Now, this is not charity. They're going to place a fee on this. There's a $7 million commission, which is about 11% markup, which is a great return on an investment. And this was something that Cleveland felt was necessary, but a lot of people criticized this because they felt that by these bankers bailing out the federal government, of course, it will give the bankers even more influence and more power over the federal government. It seemed to your average working class person like the rich were all kind of conspiring behind the scenes, and they're not worrying about helping the average American worker. Okay, so in this topic we covered what laissez-faire was. We looked at some of the limits of laissez-faire. We talked about some of the famous big strikes, like the Great Railroad Strike, the Pullman Strike, and we also talked about the Panic of 1893 and its many, many ripple effects. All right, that is it for this topic. We have one more left in Period 6. I know it seems like Period 6 goes on forever, and it kind of does, but one more video and we will be done.